After World War II, when TVs entered people's houses, everybody was concerned about the programs on TV, how good they are, how educational they are for kids, what impacts they would have on how families spend their leisure time. When everybody was concerned about the quality and quantity of programs on TV, Marsha McLuhan said, if you think the content of TV is what we should be worried about, joke's on you. In 2024, if you think the content of AI programs, what they produce, how accurate they are, or how biased they are is what we should be worried about, joke's not anymore on you, it's on all of us. Hello, I'm Mujan, and this is Sail on a Beach podcast. This episode, The Man at the End of the Mechanical Age. The years after World War II and the 1950s are known to be years of high hopes in science and bold ideas. The time when scholars weren't afraid anymore to tackle complex problems. The time when they thought they could understand and manage systems as complex as cities or human minds using scientific approaches. There's so many different explanations of why there was such an interest in rational approaches to problem solving, system thinking, and more broadly, this positivistic view of the world. Some would argue that it all had to do with the post-war social context. That after all that communities went through, there was a psychological need for a sense of control over chaos and complexity. That communities and scholars needed this almost exaggerated view of human capacity in managing complexity around them. Those who tend to associate social and economic changes with technological advances, those who always talk about the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, and so on, would argue that this was all due to the increased computation capacities of technologies available to societies and scholars. Technologies were and are extensions of humans. So when their capacity increased, it gave humans this sense that now they could perform way more sophisticated tasks and solve way more complex problems. With these technologies being able to store and analyze the vast amount of information, scholars could not only predict the future, but also analyze the past. They could connect the past and future like never before. There's also a group of scholars who argue that this had nothing to do with war, that the ideas of the 1950s were just a natural progression of modern thought. They say that the post-war era was more of a catalyst, helping those ideas mature and find real-world applications. Others have a more cynical take on what happened in the 50s. They believe that we didn't need these technologies and approaches, that they were pushed on us by people involved in their development for military purposes. Most of these technologies and approaches were in fact the result of research done during the war. They were funded by military organizations. In a post-war period, immediately after World War II, the United States Army Air Forces established Project RAND. Its objective was to investigate the long-range planning of intercontinental warfare. In the 50s, though, Project RAND evolved into the RAND Corporation and expanded its research into civilian fields like education and international affairs. Its focus became the expansion of what is now known as operations research. It's a strand of research that deals with development and application of analytical methods to improve decision-making. It was about employing techniques from other mathematical sciences like modeling, statistics, and optimization to find an optimal or near-optimal solutions to decision-making problems. For this group, there wasn't any evidence on suitability of these approaches for addressing social problems or any documented immediate need for them. It was rather the political and economic incentives for the actors involved that led to the increased popularity of these approaches, making us more a victim of these technological advances rather than their beneficiaries. All these explanations have some truth to them. They've all shaped in one way or another how we relate to technology today, how we talk about the people who develop it, how we push back against them, and how we tackle complex problems. And there's one thing they all share. They all based their idea on the assumption that system thinking, rational problem solving, and scientific approaches were in fact the popular approaches adopted by scholars. But was it really the case that scholars widely promoted these ideas? In 2016, I was writing up my PhD thesis. My project was about how planners design and use games as part of their practices. My main question was why we always end up with simulator worlds in these games. Why do planners feel the need to always replicate reality within these game environments? Why maps and charts and not really fun narrative-based games? There was this quote that kept popping up in every paper I've read about the validity of games in social science and urban planning. It was from a book called Simulation and Society by John Razer. The quote went like this: "A model can only be said to be valid to the extent that investigations of that model provides the same outcome as would investigations in the reference system." Everybody used these lines to argue that if you want to get any valid evidence from these game environments, you have to treat them as a simulation, because the behavior within the game environment won't be scientifically valid if they don't represent or replicate the behavior in the real world. But strangely, these lines were the only ones that were referenced from Razer's work. We're not talking about just another book on gaming and simulation. This book was mentioned by almost all the scholars working on the use and design of games in planning in the 70s and 80s. In the preface of the book, it's written, "This book is designed to introduce social scientists to a sphere of activity with which they might not be familiar, that of simulation and gaming. It's particularly designed for undergraduate and graduate students of sociology, history, political science, psychology, economics, and anthropology, disciplines in which the simulation technique is becoming a major research and teaching device." Razer starts the book by referring to the work of Johann Huizinga on Homo ludens, a theory that proposes that most human institutions and human activities are in large part simply the product of the human desire to engage in a more elaborate, subtle, and satisfying forms of play. Huizinga's provocative view of man as Homo ludens is probably no more adequate a description of human complexity or explanation of human institutions than are the concepts of rational man, irrational man, or man as mechanisms. But Huizinga's view does capture a central truth: men enjoy playing. He later continues, why a methodology book about simulation? Because the type of thinking employed in constructing and operating a simulation, and in developing its cousins, system analysis, operations research, and systems design, has become a powerful social force in a contemporary world. Robert Boguslaw argues that those who use these methods, the social engineers of our times, are creating a world based on sets of values that may be quite at variance with many of our traditional aspirations. Unless we understand the systems approach, both its great usefulness and its potential dangers, we may have to adjust to the world in which the humanistic, individualistic values have been submerged. From the very first pages of the book, Razer sets the goal for creating these simulations as playing around with environments to understand the world around us through play, through experimenting in these simulated worlds. And what he wrote about these simulations and their validity couldn't be far from how they were represented in papers and games in urban planning. Then I look at other historical documents and experiments around games and planning. I realized that most of the stories that I was told about these experiments are not exactly how they were perceived at the time. Most of the writers were way more critical about the value of these games and their applicability to understanding social problems. Even Alan Newer, who was the father of artificial intelligence, was very explicit about the fact that his aim is not to create systems that replicate the human mind. What he was interested in was not to make artificial systems as powerful as humans, but to explore the limits of human cognition through these systems, to understand when and why humans fail in using their cognitive abilities effectively. In the early 60s also, you see a lot of artists, designers, and wider communities writing about the impacts these technologies have on our psyche, on our living environments, and how we relate to each other. The topic of technology and its impact on society went beyond just social science, computer science, and academia. Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, and other so-called media ecologists wrote extensively on how the introduction of new media and technologies impacts the human psyche. They insisted that regardless of what they're designed to do or what they end up being used for, their mere existence changes our environment, our psyche, the way we relate to reality, and the way we relate to each other. And it's understanding these changes to the psyche of human beings that's important in understanding these technologies and finding ways to work for or against them. You have Neil Postman writing about learning and education in the digital era, how this obsession with numerical evaluation, giving grades to students, evaluating their performance, or measuring their learning impacts the relationship we have with our own capacities. You have John Razor writing about weaponry and their impact on deterrence strategies, saying that not the use but the mere existence of these weaponry changes the quality of our decisions and the way we relate to our enemies. Susan Sontag wrote extensively on photography and how the advent of cameras and then later cameras becoming more and more accessible and portable changed our relationship to reality, to what we see and what we count as evidence. She details how picture taking has become a form of evidence collection, how images started to be used and thought of as evidence, as a way of documenting reality in reporting on the states of cities, poverty, and communities. What's evident from the works and writings of that time is that in its early days, more than trying to push these theories and ideas on communities, scholars used these technologies as a prompt to understand the limits of our knowledge about human thinking, human cognition, and the ways we approach problems. When you look at the historical documents and the papers published, you realize that for every proponent of system thinking, there were probably 10 critiques. More than rational approaches and system thinking, these scholars' obsession was with understanding human cognition and the human mind. The works on behavioral economics, the call for more theoretical studies on creativity, works on artificial intelligence and problem solving, simulation and gaming, and the works happening in public administration field were not so disconnected from each other. But why was that? Why decision making and the human mind? Why did human thinking become such a big topic? Here's where it becomes the chicken and egg problem. Was it the case that these technologies pushed us to focus on rationality and replicating the human mind? Or was it for the need to understand the human mind that we created these technologies? For a while, I was looking for an answer to this question in the works of media studies scholars and computer science historians, until I came across this book called The Ways of Curating by Hans Ulrich Obrist. The book itself is all about Obrist's life, people he met, events he attended, things that inspired him to become a curator. But somewhere in the book, it talks about an exhibition curated by Pontus Holten in 1968. The title of the exhibition was Machines as Seen at the End of the Mechanical Age. In this exhibition, Holten wanted to explore both the approaching end of the mechanical age and the role of machines in art, industrial design, and photography. He opened the exhibition by writing these lines. Technology today is undergoing a critical transition. We're surrounded by the outward manifestations of the culmination of the mechanical age. Yet at the same time, the mechanical machine, which can most easily be defined as an imitation of our muscles, is losing its dominating position among the tools of mankind. While electronic and chemical devices which imitate the process of the brain and neuron system are becoming increasingly important. During the mechanical age, technologies were imitating our muscles. The power and limits of our muscles are very tangible and known to us. People can easily see how much weight they can carry, how fast they can run, and how far they can see. Knowing the muscular limits meant that it was easy to define when and how these technologies can extend us. Then came the First World War, during which electronic devices were designed for communication purposes. But when these technologies like radio became widely available, the question then was, what are they exactly extending? What capabilities they're extending? To make these technologies, scholars had to find out how we communicate, how we perceive words, how we talk about different concepts, and what are the muscles that make us communicate. The biggest muscle involved was our brain. Our brain power and its processes weren't so obvious to us. There was a need for studies on human cognition and the human brain to understand its limits and to extend it with technology. That in itself wasn't an easy task. We still don't know much about brain processes, and we can't claim that we can fully understand our brain power. In the early days, scholars could only start with those brain processes that had tangible manifestations, words spoken, choices, behaviors, and stated preferences. All they had available to them to understand humans in a way that they could be designed for was scientific methods. They could only explain parts of the brain processes that they could see, they could replicate, and they could examine. The immediate examples of processes with these qualities were the ones that already involved some sort of rational thinking, processes that required structured forms of thinking and limited behaviors. This is why games, language, and highly structured and highly ruled environments became great case studies. When it came to understanding more complex processes like decision-making, strategic thinking, or creativity, they didn't have enough resources to understand those parts of these processes that they couldn't communicate or logically explain. The experiments Alan Newell, Cliff Shaw, and Herbert Simon were doing were the first of its kind to understand parts of the brain which go beyond rational thinking. When they published their report, philosophers and psychologists like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi could easily critique their work and say, well, it's obvious that there's way more to creativity than scientific problem solving or heuristic search. But it took them 30 years to explain what those extra things are. Without knowing what those extra things were, designing technologies that could extend those capabilities was quite impossible. And some of you might say that this whole idea of creating technologies that can imitate our brain processes is a dangerous or pointless one, which is valid and worth more critical discussions and reflections. But looking at these technologies as extensions of humans rather than these external entities with computational capacity means that if you're unhappy about how much these technologies objectify humans and their experiences, the way to go against them is not to democratize them. It's not to use the same technologies to design experiences that are more just or inclusive. It would be about acknowledging and critically reflecting on the irrationality of our decision-making, of our thinking, of our processes. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about the works of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I'm going to tell you about his response to Simon's work and the back and forth communications they had.